Hello, my name is Anniken. I design knitting patterns. I teach knitting workshops online and in person, and I sell yarn through my website, YarnAddict.co.uk. Welcome to today's video. Today I'm going to talk about what to do if you have a problem with a pattern or if you have a question about a pattern. This is inspired by a blog post that I wrote in, I think, 2016, and I haven't updated my blog for a long time, but I used to be quite a keen blogger. And there are some very useful blog posts that I'm slowly trying to turn into videos, so they're accessible in a different format. If you prefer to read, I will link the original blog post below this video. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. If you're already a subscriber, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time. It really helps me a lot to grow my channel and reach more people. If you have any views or opinions or comments about today's topic, please share them below this video. And in the notes below this video, you'll find all the links to my social media, how to sign up to my newsletter, my online courses, my website, all that kind of stuff can be found below this video. So you bought a pattern, you're knitting along quite happily, or you're struggling to get started, whichever the case may be, and you come across a problem. You can't get started, you're knitting away happily, and suddenly you find a problem. You find something that you think might be a mistake, but you're not sure, and you need to ask someone. You don't have anyone in your life who can help, or maybe you've asked somebody you know who's maybe more experienced knitter than you, and you're still not sure, and you decide you need to contact the designer. So what do? Do you message a designer privately through social media or Ravelry? Do you email the designer? Do you contact the yarn company? Do you pop into your local yarn shop? Do you ask in your favorite online knitting forum? These are all valid kind of routes to find out the information you want. Knowing how to approach a problem like that can help you get result much quicker. So in this video, I'm going to share some of my tips for how to deal with these pattern problems and questions as quickly as possible, and also how to get the best out of designers. I have been designing for quite a few years now, since 2006, 2007, something like that, and I have been published in loads of magazines. I've designed for loads of yarn companies. I've self-published. I've taught in loads of yarn shops as well. I've been in yarn shops when somebody's come in with a question and the owner or staff member has come over to me and interrupted me while I'm teaching and said, "Can I just ask you about this pattern?" And it's not my pattern. Or "I have a question, can you just help me quickly?" And I've had loads of people contact me through social media, through my Facebook group, through my Ravelry group. I used to have a group on Ravelry, I don't anymore. I used to also allow people to contact me via private message on Ravelry, which I don't anymore, and I'll come back to that later. And I've had people email me. I've had polite emails, I've had lots of polite emails. So today I'm going to share advice on how you can get the answer you need as quickly as possible. So where you go with pattern questions depends on what the problem is, and here is my advice. Please note that other designers may have different opinions to me. I'm not saying this is the only way to approach things. This is just my advice for how you can get the answer you need as quickly as possible. So you think there is a problem in the pattern, you think there's an error in the pattern. I know we all hate errors in the patterns, and I know we all think there should never be an error in the pattern, but designers are humans, pattern writers are humans. Any professional designer should have their pattern checked by a tech editor. Some designers also get their patterns test knitted. There is this conception, no, there is this kind of assumption out there that if you have your pattern test knitted, it's more likely to be error free. That's wrong, in my opinion. Test knit, I could probably do a whole other video just on that really, but most designers who use test knitters use it for one or two reasons. Either they don't have a tech editor, so they use test knitters, which are usually free, not paid. So they usually use unpaid test knitters to test their patterns instead of having it professionally tech edited. that's a big no-no. I know it's difficult when you're starting out as a designer to find a tech editor or to pay for a tech editor, because you have to pay before you sell a single copy of your pattern. But all businesses really have costs involved before you start earning money. Having said that, I will make an admission here. When I started designing, when I started self-publishing patterns, I didn't know that tech editors existed. I didn't know that pattern checkers existed. I didn't know I was supposed to have my patterns checked. First few patterns I published, I use that term lightly, I wrote them up. Oh, they were awful. I think the only place I sold them was through a yarn shop called Spinner Yarn in Devon. I was friendly with the owner who started the shop, and she bought some of the patterns from me, and I don't know how many she sold, but when she sold the shop, she was clearing up and she found a folder with some of my old patterns, so she gave me copies of them, and I've got them in my office somewhere, and they are so bad. And I didn't know what pattern checkers or tech editors were, so those patterns were not tech edited. Later on, I became friendly with somebody who would test knit for me, so I would get her to test knit it and tell me about any problems she found, and I would use that as a way of having my patterns checked. And then I started designing for magazines, and then I realized that they had pattern checkers, and I was like, oh, I wonder how I get one of those. Now, back in those days, because we're talking, you know, when the internet for most of us was still in its kind of early stages. Some of us had computers at home, some people probably didn't yet. It was before Ravelry, and I wasn't in like a group of designers that I didn't know designers that I could ask these kind of questions. So I didn't really know what I was doing till I started working with magazines. Then I realized that they had their patterns checked, and I thought maybe I should. And then I was asked to do a commission for a yarn company. They approached me after I'd used their yarn in a magazine. I'm actually going to do a whole other video about how I got started as a designer, and I'm not sure that'll be up before or after this video. Maybe up before, in which case I'll link it below, or maybe out afterwards. So make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss it. But I was told by this yarn company that I had to have the patterns tech edited. So I was like, now what do I do? So I contacted one of the freelance tech editors or pattern checkers I work with on one of the magazines I designed for, and said to her, I need a tech editor help. And she started tech editing for me, and then since then I've gone through a couple others. And my current tech editor, I don't know how long I've been working with her, but it's been a few years now. And I think I originally met her at a workshop. I think she came to one of my workshops somewhere, and I think she mentioned that she was tech editing for a designer I knew. So when the tech editor I was using at the time became really busy with other clients and I was struggling to book time with her, I contacted this particular tech editor, and she started tech editing for me. These days it's a lot easier to find a tech editor, and I don't think there's really any excuse not to use a tech editor, apart from maybe the cost. And even if you publish a pattern free of charge, you probably should have a tech editor, unless you just write up the pattern and you make it clear that it's free and that it has not been tech edited. But if you want to design as a career, you really need to get a tech editor. These days there are lots of easier ways to connect with other designers. Ravelry used to have several designers groups and tech editors groups. I've not been active in the Ravelry forums for a long time, so I don't know what they're like now, but there's ways of, there's, you know, people on Instagram, there's are they called tech edit tips or something, account on Instagram that do a lot of stuff on tech editing. There are other ways of connecting now, and I think it's a lot easier to connect. There's also books on designing, and it's just easier to find information now, I think. So I don't think there's any excuse these days not to have your pattern tech edited. Anyway, I went off on a bit of a tangent there, so let's get back to what we were talking about. Anyway, the tech editor's job, or pattern checkers' jobs, magazines tend to call them pattern checkers. Freelance designers tend to call them tech editors. I prefer to use the tech editor because it sounds a little bit more professional, I think, because they are very, very important to me and my patterns. And their job is really to check the pattern to check if there are any errors, if all the maths is correct, if the terminology and the language is correct, if there's any grammatical, punctuation errors, things like that. And they also check like the consistency of the pattern. Are you sticking to your style sheet, to the way or the publication style sheet if you're working from a magazine or a yarn company or something? And they just try and make sure that your pattern can be knitted and to create the item that is expected, so that it will create the item that you're saying it will create. And the thing is, we're all humans. I'm human, my tech editor is human, the tech editors I work with on magazines are human, and we all make mistakes, and it's very easy to make silly mistakes and for them to just go under the radar. If I send a pattern to my tech editor, she'll check it and she'll send it back to me. I'll make the corrections that she's suggested. I'll send it back to her. She'll check it again. She'll send it back to me. I'll make more corrections. And it usually, I mean, a simple pattern may only go back and forth like 2 or 3 times. Some patterns can go back and forth 4, 5, 6, 7 times. So, you know, we've both had our eyes on it quite a few times before the pattern gets published. But there are still things that slip under the radar. I remember once I had a pattern. I used to have a regular customer who used to like knitting my patterns. Sadly, she's passed away. I never had the chance to meet her, but we did communicate via email over the years, and she'd been knitting my patterns for quite a long time, but she was blind, and she relied on a screen reader to read my patterns. And I remember her telling me that sometimes when it's in a PDF with like different formatting and stuff, sometimes the screen reader wouldn't necessarily pick up all the information. So once she emailed me and she said this pattern, and she used to knit some quite complicated lace patterns. She emailed me and she said, this pattern, when I finished it, what do I do? Do I just cast off? I can't. Or do I do anything else? Are there any instructions for casting off? My screen reader doesn't seem to pick anything up. So I was like, well, of course it will say cast off using the Russian cast off, which is my standard way of ending most lace patterns, because the Russian cast off is a stretchy cast off. I have no idea whether it's actually Russian or not, but and I was just thinking, yeah, of course it does. But of course I opened the pattern and checked, and no, there were no cast off instructions. Both myself and my tech editor at the time had managed to miss it. And there are times when people email me with a question, and sometimes it can be a really basic question that both myself and my tech editor have missed, usually because it's very, very simple. Other times it can be more important mistakes that we have both managed to miss somehow. I always assume when somebody emails me saying they think there's an error in my pattern, that there is an error, and I get that pattern out and I check it, and I double check everything that is relevant to the question. And most of the time it's not an error. Sometimes there is an error. If there is an error, then I correct it. I send the person a new copy of the pattern. I apologize. Sometimes in magazines there may be an error introduced that wasn't in my original pattern. That's happened a few times. With most magazines, I don't get to see the pattern before it's published. So the tech editor that works for the magazine may email me with questions while they're tech editing, but they don't normally send me like a final copy for me to approve before it's published. Some young companies do that, and some of the American magazines I work with do that. But most of the British magazines I work for, I don't think do that as a routine. Sometimes if the tech editor has a lot of questions or things that I have to decide, then they will send it to me from my comments, but I don't normally see a final copy till it's in the magazine. So designers hate errors more than knitters do, because it just creates a lot of extra work for us. And sometimes I've had to send patterns back to my tech editor for her to just double check it after I've corrected an error, just to make sure I haven't made another mistake while correcting the original mistake. So if you think there's an error in the pattern, who you contact depends on where the pattern is from. If you can contact the designer correctly, that's probably the best way to go about it. Most British magazines will name the designer, and if you Google them, usually you can find their website or some way of contacting them. Most designers, I think, would prefer to be contacted by their email address. If you're not sure how to contact them and it's a pattern that's in a magazine or from a yarn company, you can contact the magazine or yarn company directly, and they will either answer the question for you or they will put you in touch with the designer. In my experience, most yarn companies I worked for and magazines I worked for, if they get a question about a pattern, they will forward it to me for me to answer. And obviously that will take a little bit longer because it'll go through one person before it gets to me, so that might take a bit longer. Or if you know who the designer is, you can try and find their information and contact them directly. Some yarn companies may not always name the designer, it may not just be the name of the yarn company. So if that's the case, then the best way is to contact the yarn company. And most of the time these days you can find an email address online. I know some people would prefer to call. I want to say maybe that's an age thing. I don't know. I don't want to be ageist here, but I do have friends who are older than me who would prefer to call rather than email. I would say I think most designers and yarn companies and magazines would be prefer to be contacted by email. I do not routinely give out my phone number. If somebody calls me from an unknown number on my mobile, and I only give out my mobile phone number now, I no longer give out my home phone number, mainly because at the moment we don't have a home phone. And I don't pick up any calls on my mobile if I don't recognize the number. And if somebody rang me and left a message, I would call them back. The only time people would get my number really, unless I gave it to them, would be if I did a yarn show. Most yarn shops still require people or the stall holders to put their contact phone number in the brochure, in the kind of show listing. I don't really like doing it, but if that's what they require, then that's what I got to do. My preferred way to be contacted is by email. Many magazines, yarn companies and designers also have a list of errata, so before you contact a designer or a yarn company or magazine, you could see if you can find a list of errata. I used to try and put them on my website, but I didn't find a very good way of doing that, so then I started putting them on the Ravelry page. Now, I haven't checked how many patterns I have listed on Ravelry, but there are several hundred of them. And I have a lot of patterns that are not on Ravelry, so the true number is probably close to 100 higher than what it says on Ravelry. And obviously not all of them have errata, but some of them do. And trying to put that on my website just became very difficult. So I started putting it on the Ravelry page. Obviously not all of my patterns have a Ravelry page because I haven't been very good, especially in the last few years, to kind of keep on top of adding all my magazine patterns and stuff to Ravelry. All the patterns I sell are on Ravelry. But obviously these days a lot of people choose not to buy from Ravelry, and some people can't use Ravelry after they did a redesign about 3 years ago. They introduced colour schemes and graphics and things that cause visual disturbances and migraines, and from anything from mild problems to really severe problems for a lot of people. And I don't want to go into the whole history of that debacle, but a lot of people either can't use Ravelry for health reasons or choose not to, which I quite understand and respect. Most of my patterns are for sale on Payhip. I haven't gone and added all my old patterns on Payhip because they don't sell that much, so I haven't. And also I just have too many patterns, but I make sure all my new patterns are on Payhip. I also have some older patterns on Lovecraft, but I haven't added any new patterns to Lovecraft for probably at least 3 years, I think now. And most of my patterns are added to Ravelry and Payhip. Obviously Payhip is only the patterns that I sell. Patterns are in magazines and my books and the design for yarn companies and stuff. I don't have a Payhip listing for them, so it can be difficult to find an errata. If you can find an errata, that will save you time obviously, but that can be difficult to find. So if you can't find an errata, I wouldn't expect people to spend hours looking for one, but I'm quite happy for people to email me, and if there is an errata, I will copy and paste it into the pattern. If I'm made aware of an error in a pattern that I sell myself, then I will update the pattern and And then when I update a pattern on Ravelry and upload a new copy, it automatically gets sent to everyone who's bought that pattern. I think the same thing happens for PayHip, but I'm not 100% sure. Many designers are contactable via social media and Ravelry, but I think most that I know at least seem to prefer you to contact them via email. I don't like people contacting me via private message on Twitter or Instagram, for example, to ask pattern questions, because it becomes difficult to keep track of that. I quite often do social media when I'm not in my office, and if somebody's emailing me about a pattern question, I need to look at that pattern, check to see if there is a mistake. Sometimes it may be a pattern I designed years ago that I can't even remember, and I need to go and read through the pattern, get my head back in that kind of space, back into that pattern, which can take a bit of time before I can answer the question. Sometimes I have to write notes, things like that. Depends on how easy or difficult the question is. So if somebody messages me on Instagram, for example, I may see the message, read it, and then say, I can't answer that till I'm back in my office at my desk. I know it's only upstairs in my house, but if I'm sitting downstairs in the evening watching a program with my family, I don't necessarily want to run upstairs and start answering pattern questions at 9 o'clock at night, for example, or over the weekend. I try and keep my work hours fairly restricted, and I try to only answer emails during those hours. So I would say the most professional thing would be to contact people via their email, unless they specifically let it known that they're happy for you to contact them in other ways. I have kind of said that people can ask in my Facebook group. Sometimes if I'm lucky, somebody else will come along see it before me and answer if it's something easy or like a technique based question rather than a specific pattern question. But if it is a specific pattern question, sometimes I've been able to look up the pattern and answer it and post that in the Facebook group. Sometimes I've had to say to people, can you please email me and I will sort it out next time I'm in the office. Just depends on the question and how complicated it is. But I would say most people probably prefer to email them rather than use social media. One thing I think most designers find quite frustrating is when knitters immediately assume that there is an error in the pattern or that it's the designer's fault. It seems to me that a lot of knitters, if they can't knit the pattern, they immediately jump to the conclusion that there's something wrong with the pattern, and that it's not that they haven't read it correctly or that they haven't got the correct skills or experience or they don't know the technique. And most of the time it is a case, at least in my experience, it is a case of the knitter not understanding what they're supposed to do, not reading the pattern correctly, not doing what the pattern tells them to do, rather than a mistake on my part. So if you start kind of complaining about a designer on social media and things or in public, when it turns out it's not actually their fault and it's just you misunderstanding or not having the right skills or not knowing what you're supposed to do, you're buying a knitting pattern. Knitting patterns tend to cost between £4, £5, £6 maybe. It's fairly cheap in the grand scheme of things. It's not supposed to be like a private lesson in how to knit something. It's supposed to be a pattern, and if you don't have the skills needed to knit that pattern, that's not really the designer's fault. So please treat designers with kindness. I've had some incredibly rude emails over the years, and like really short ones, like just like, this pattern is rubbish, or there's something wrong with this pattern, and they're not telling me what they think is wrong. Or yeah, or somebody who's basically like saying, I think this is wrong and this is how you should be writing it. So yeah, don't do that. Just be polite. Just say, I'm not sure, I'm struggling with this part of the pattern. Is there a mistake? Is there something I'm not getting right? Have I misunderstood something? Can you help me? And then you're likely to get a more positive reply. Some of the emails I've got where people complain about patterns, I have just deleted the email and not replied if people have been particularly rude. So do double check the pattern and your knitting and make sure it's not you making a mistake. If you come across something and you think you're stuck, don't immediately jump on your phone or your computer and email the designer and say, there's something wrong, help me. maybe just put it away for a bit, take a break from it, come back to it, reread the pattern, check your knitting, see if you can work it out. Usually that'll be quicker as well, because most designers aren't sitting by the computer waiting for your email. We do have other things to do, and most of us are single woman businesses who don't have any staff and don't work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And also be aware of where the designer is based compared to where you're based. If I get, say, somebody in the States who emails me on a weekend and then I don't reply, and when I check the time of the email, so then I get a second email a couple hours later saying, are you going to reply to me? And I'm like, it's Saturday, 2 a.m. at my time. I'm not staying up all night replying. I don't have 24-hour customer service. So bear that in mind as well, please. If you don't understand a stitch or a technique, these days there's so much information online. I wouldn't necessarily say it would be my first choice to contact the designer to ask about a particular stitch, how to work a particular stitch, or how to work a particular technique. I'd probably try Googling it first and see if I can find some information. If you're not sure what the technique is called or whether you're Googling the right technique, then of course you can say, you can email the designer for clarification. But on the whole, if it's like a how to work a stitch technique based type question, you will probably get an answer much quicker if you just Google it, search on YouTube, whatever. I have lots of tutorials on my website, and sometimes I will just send people a link to an appropriate tutorial and say, I think this tutorial will answer your question. But usually before I do that, I have checked the pattern to make sure there isn't a mistake, and if there isn't and I have a tutorial that I think might help, I will email them that. But sometimes I've already spent like half an hour on that pattern. Sometimes when I go and open my emails to reply pattern questions, I maybe spend an hour and I've replied to one email. And I must admit, I'm not always the quickest to reply to emails. I can be a bit slow at replying to emails. Apologies if you've been waiting. If you think it's taken too long, email again. But you should give somebody at least 24 to 48 hours, I think, depending on what time of the week and things you email. Obviously, weekends and public holidays, you need to give them more. And obviously, remember, public holidays varies from country to country. Anyway, back to technique stuff. So if there's technique stuff, it's probably quicker for you to Google it yourself. If you're not sure how to do a particular decrease, it's easier for you to Google it. You can even just type in SSK into Google and get tutorials for how to do an SSK if you're not sure. Also remember that some techniques can be known by different names. So for example, I often use a decrease called Russian cast off in my patterns. So when I came across that cast off, it's a very stretchy cast off that I like to use for lace shawls. When I first came across it, wherever, I think I found it on the blog or something many years ago, and it was called the Russian cast off. I've seen it called stretchy cast off, lace cast off, other things. I always aim to include the instructions for how to do it in my patterns. Occasionally I might forget, but I think that's pretty rare because it's one of the standard things that is in my I have like a list of instructions and techniques and things I use frequently that's in my pattern template, and if I don't use it in that pattern, I have to physically delete it. So usually it's there. If you don't understand the instructions, which are knit 2, slip both stitches back to left hand needle, knit 2 together through the back of loop. If you don't understand that, Google it, but be aware that some techniques can be known under different names. Another example that pops into my head is the what was it called? The toe-up cast on I use for toe-up socks, which is called Turkish cast on. I've also seen that called the Eastern cast on. So different techniques can be known by different names. Sometimes the same technique can be known by 2 names. Sometimes the same thing can be done different ways. Like for example, a long tail cast on. There is the continental long tail cast on, the way I do it, and there is a thumb long tail cast on. They give the same results, but you do it differently. From what I've been told, the German twisted cast on and the old Norwegian cast on is basically the same cast on with 2 different names. Correct me if I'm wrong. So there are things like that which can make things confusing. So a few do's and don'ts when it comes to asking for help. If you purchase the pattern in a yarn shop, I would say it's acceptable to go back to the yarn shop and ask them for help. If you had purchased the yarn in the yarn shop, but you haven't purchased the pattern, and you go to the yarn shop and say, can you help me with this pattern? They might be kind to help you, but they may not, because you didn't purchase a pattern from them, so they may not know how to help you. If you haven't purchased either the yarn or the pattern from a yarn shop, I would say it's pretty cheeky or even downright rude to go and expect them to help you, especially if you walk in and say, I got this pattern online, I got this yarn online, but I'm stuck, can you help me? If they say, sorry, we can't help, I think that's perfectly acceptable. If some places they may be kind enough to help. I know one yarn shop where I've been teaching in the past, I don't know if she still does this, but I know she used to. If a pattern question or a technique question in general was going to take more than a couple of minutes to answer, then she would make people book in for like a one-to-one like troubleshooting session, which I think is quite reasonable, and I think they had to pay for that because she was usually on her own in the shop, so she couldn't spend half an hour with somebody helping them sort out a problem, even if they bought the pattern from her, because she had other customers in the shop. So I think that's quite reasonable, and maybe a tip to yarn shop owners who do have a problem with people coming asking for help. Another thing is, if you attend a local knitting group in person, it might be good to ask people, especially technique questions, to ask people in the knitting group. There might be somebody there who's more experienced than you and can help you. I used to be quite a regular member of my local knitting group. I haven't actually been since before COVID, and I wasn't that regular the last couple of years before COVID started. I think I'm still kind of like an honorary member, but I haven't actually been to the group for a long time. But there was a period where every time I turned up, sometimes I would barely sit down, and somebody would say, Anniken, can you help me with this? Anniken, what can you do this? Can you, and it got to the point where I was like, I almost didn't want to go at one point, because I just felt like every time I turned up, somebody would ambush me with a question, and I didn't mind helping, but I was also, it was my time off. I was there to sit and chat and knit, not spend the whole time sorting out other people's questions and problems. But obviously people knew that I did this as a job. As the years went on, more and more knitters, they gained experience, so I wasn't the go-to person for questions anymore. And then there were times when I started going less because I was busy teaching and designing and things, so work stopped me from going quite so frequently. So then people started relying on other people to help them. So if I went back now, I wouldn't necessarily be the first person somebody would ask. If somebody was knitting one of my patterns, then I would be quite happy for them to ask me, of course. If you've got a favourite designer or knitting teacher that you like, maybe somebody whose workshops you've attended regularly, and you go to them for help, but it's not their pattern. So I've had people contact me about other people's patterns because they know me, they've been to my workshops, they've met me several times, they feel comfortable approaching me, but it's not my pattern. So if somebody brings it to a workshop, I will usually have a look at it and try and help them. Usually I'll say, if somebody says that to me, I'll say, we'll have a look at it at lunchtime. I don't like it, unless it's my pattern, I don't like it when people do it at the end of the day, because usually at the end of the day, when the workshop's finished, I want to go home. It's been a long day. Usually I have a long drive home, and I want to go home. So if you are going to ask a teacher in a workshop, for example, mention it early on in the day and say, can I ask you about this later on? Is one of your patterns or is somebody else's pattern? And then I would normally say, yes, we'll have a look at it at lunchtime. But if it's somebody else's pattern, I might spend a few minutes on it, but if I can't work it out, I may say, actually, I think you ought to contact that designer, because it's not really my job to spend time working it out. Just kind of a reminder how to get the best out of designers. Don't be rude. All designers I know can share emails of some incredibly rude emails we've received over the years. So don't be rude, be polite. I know emails are casual, but still be polite. Say, hi Anniken, dear Miss Allis, whatever. Hope you don't mind me emailing you. I'm stuck on this. It's your pattern. I'm stuck. Is there a mistake? Can you help me with what to do? I'm not quite sure whether there's a mistake in the pattern or whether it's me making a mistake. Can you help me? Something along like that. Try and give them as much information as possible. Don't say, I'm knitting your red shawl from Knitting Magazine or the Knitter Magazine. I've had loads of patterns in those magazines. Try and give, if it's a pattern from a magazine or a book, try and give like the name of the pattern and the issue it was in. So if somebody says, I'm knitting the sweater you designed for the Knitter Magazine, issue 25, published in whatever, all this information is on the front of the magazine. Or I'm struggling with your pattern that I bought from you wherever, or I'm struggling with the pattern from your book Easy Lace Knits, for example. If you can be more specific, then that helps. I may still have to go on Ravelry just search for the pattern to remind myself of what it actually is, but that's because I've designed so many things I can't remember them all anymore. Include as much information as you can. So the more information, not to say I can't do it, I'm stuck. Try and include as much information as you can. Say where you've got to, what you're stuck on, what you don't understand. Because I have sometimes spent quite a considerable amount of time, like half an hour, explaining that something, and then somebody said, yeah, I get that, but it's the next bit I don't get. Well, you didn't tell me that. So be as specific as you can. And give people a chance to don't immediately assume there is a mistake in the pattern. Maybe say, I'm not sure there's a mistake in the pattern or whether it's me misunderstanding it. Because it might be you misunderstanding it. There may not be a mistake in the pattern. There may be a mistake in the pattern, but if you say, I'm not sure if there's a mistake, or is there a mistake in the pattern, rather than there is a mistake in the pattern, you'll get a better reaction, I think. Don't expect an immediate reply. I check emails at certain days and times. Sometimes I do get very behind, I must admit. I don't enjoy doing emails. And sometimes if I'm busy, I will put them off. And sometimes, especially if I go on holiday or I have a lot of workshops or I'm away teaching or at shows, I will get very behind and then I'll struggle to catch up. Better than I used to be, but if you don't get a reply within what you consider to be a reasonable amount of time, then do email again. Sometimes things go in our spam folder. I'm not very good at checking my spam folder. I try and do it weekly. I don't always remember, and things get deleted from spam. Sometimes things may go in like a promotions folder. So just be sensible. So if you don't get a reply, just email again and say, I'm not sure you got this, not sure you've been busy. I just want to check whether you got this email. May have gone in your spam folder, whatever. And do give me a few days to reply, because I don't reply to emails every single day. I sleep, I have time off, I teach, I go away, all that kind of stuff. I try and make sure I put an out of hours on my email when I'm away for several days. I don't do that for like every night, or if I'm teaching. Usually when I'm going away for several days and I'm on holiday or something like that. Also, try not to work on evenings and weekends. So I may be posting stuff online, but that doesn't mean that I'm actually in the office working. And also sometimes when I post online, I'm not actually posting online. It's been programmed in, or it's been scheduled, sorry, to post at a certain time, and I may have scheduled that a number of days prior. So just because I've just put a post up on Instagram doesn't mean that I'm actually working on that particular day or that particular time. Don't underestimate the help you can get from your local knitting group. These days there are lots of online knitting groups as well. Become an active member and attend regularly. Don't just turn up when you need help. We used to have somebody used to come to our local knitting group. It was somebody who knew me and came because they knew me, but that person would only come, they would only come when they needed help, and they wanted me to help them. So if I wasn't there, they weren't happy about anyone else helping them, but they would only come specifically to get help, and that became a little bit annoying. Okay, so I think I've covered everything I'd planned to say. This video is a lot longer than I thought it would be. I will link to the original blog post below as well, which has a lot of information. And if you have any questions about my patterns, please contact me Best way to contact me is by email, and my email addresses are on my website. And if you don't get a reply within a few days and you think I'm being too slow, then do email me again. I don't mind being nagged. Sometimes I do have to be nagged. And if you've been waiting for a response from me or you never got a response from me, I do apologize. If you feel like you replied, do contact me again. Anyway, let me know what you think about what I've been talking about. What do you do when you find errors in patterns? I remember maybe last year or something, when I went a couple of years ago when I went to Norway, my mum was stuck on a pattern and she asked me, because I was there with them in Norway and I had a look at a pattern, I couldn't work it out. So I did actually say, I think you need to contact the designer, and it was a pattern she bought through a yarn company online. So I looked at their website and found an email address from her, and she emailed them and got a reply within a couple of days. So I tried to answer it, but I couldn't work it out. So I think there was a mistake in the pattern actually. So sometimes that is the best thing to do. Okay, I hope you like this video. Let me know what you think, your views on this topic. If you have any advice, if you disagree with me, if there's anything you think I should have mentioned I didn't, and leave me a comment below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.